Thank you. It gives me great joy now to introduce to you Regina Newchurch. So I've got to know Regina a little bit over the last couple of weeks, and I'm absolutely thrilled with the conversations we've had, Regina, and I just want to thank her for her time to come and speak from her perspective, who has also been immersed in narrative ideas and has worked both in CAMS and with Aboriginal families and communities using some of these ideas. So I think it's a real privilege that we get to hear from Regina from her practice perspective, and particularly from an Aboriginal practitioner's point of view about how we take these ideas up and use them. So thank you, Regina. And I also want to particularly thank Chris Dolman, who has also been a part of the team on this journey to do this research. And people will know Chris is a narrative therapist as well and has worked with families and particularly works with men who use violence. So for the next half hour, 40 minutes, we have the pleasure of having a conversation with Regina and Chris around their perspectives as practitioners and how they use these ideas in their work. So being able to see it on the ground and how these ideas are taken up is a real privilege. So I was wondering maybe, Chris, to get us started, you know, from your perspective as a narrative therapist who have worked with men who use violence, do you want to share with us what you think are the particular strengths of this practice?
Sure, thanks Sarah, and hi everyone. I guess there's many different kind of angles to answer that question. Be thinking a bit about what these practices can offer. And I guess as a practitioner and knowing there are a lot of practitioners in the room, I think I might start with that in a sense, that these practices can offer practitioners and agencies something. Yeah. I think they can offer practitioners and agencies a way of working that is consistent, actually, with perhaps many of the values that practitioners brought with them into this field, social workers, counsellors, whoever. Because these practices do value, respectful, accountable, safe, non-pathologising ways of working, among others. I think practitioners and agencies don't have to kind of throw these values sort of out the door when they're working with men who use violence. That it's not as though they can hold on to these practices, or we have to hold on to these practices when we're working with everyone else, then somehow discard them when we're working with men who are hurting people they care about. But we can actually continue to hold on to these things that perhaps are important to us in our work and that actually can be really sustaining for practitioners in our work. And that's what we all want, don't we, in services, to work, to be sustained and to contribute to other colleagues being sustained in this area of work as well. Yeah. So I think that's one thing I think that these practices offer. And also think of, in Uniting Communities we get many phone calls from concerned women, actually, so mums or sisters often, or nanas calling, inquiring about, so-called anger management courses for men in their lives, men that they know perhaps are hurting the partners. And, these women, are in no way condoning these actions, but are also, alongside of not condoning it, they're also, continuing, of course, to love and care for these men and wanting something different for them. And so I think these ways of working also offer them something as well, that they know that if, after all the hard work they've done, I'm not saying they should be the ones doing the hard work, doing the research, but after the research they do to try and find a service, that they can have a bit of a sense of that these guys that they're continuing to care for, whilst not condoning what they're doing, are going to be treated in a respectful, collaborative, non-pathologising way. So I think, I think that's something else that these practices offer, let alone what they offer sort of the men, the women and the children who are very much immediately affected by the use of the man's use of violence. I think also, something that also comes to mind in terms of what these practices offer is like a really dedicated paying attention to, power relations. Paying attention to, and it makes sense, doesn't it? If we understand family violence to be occurring in a socio-political context of unequal power relations, it makes sense to be drawing on practices that pay attention to that, pay attention to the, the power relations that are obviously creating a context for the violence and abuse in the family to occur, in terms of a gendered analysis of violence. I guess also paying attention to the power relations that have kind of been present throughout the man in his life as well, because we know often that men who are accessing these services, have also had experiences of as boys or young men of being subjected to abuse or injustices or other outrageous acts, or both interpersonal abuse as well as the abuse that comes about through engaging in all of our systems and structures. And so I think these practices also provide a way where we can engage around what Michael White called the politics of experience, or what Alan Jenkins calls the politics of disadvantage, and have conversations with men about those things that doesn't diminish their responsibility for what they're doing and for the hurt they're causing, but also doesn't brush over those experiences either. And of course also these practices pay attention to the politics of practice, the power relations that are inherent in the therapeutic relationship as well. And I think provides practitioners with a way of working that is kind of it's not the very things we're trying to support the man to move away from. That it's not kind of coercive or controlling, or doing kind of in a broad term doing violence to that man. So I think there's many things that these practices can offer.
Thank you, Chris. I think your point about having an approach where practitioners can come together and talk about ideas can create kind of that sense of belonging, or that collegiality. Having a shared language, a shared framework, can often do a lot for professional development, collegiality.
Yes.
And in this hard work, that's often needed. I also, Regina, you were drawn to narrative therapy. And so I was wondering if you want to share with us, why your journey, why you were drawn to narrative therapy, and what you might see as some of the strengths in terms of your work with Aboriginal families.
Yeah, I started the narrative when I worked for CAMS. It was part of a training for CAMS, and I wasn't sure of it at first, but got into narrative and felt this was the way to do it. My purpose for the narrative is to hear the story from the clients in a way that empowers them about strengths they feel they may have lost, or if they've got a behaviour, is it a learned behaviour from growing up, is it a social norm? And then we sort of try and work through that. So we actually it just gives them the voice to tell their story, using the narrative and about their upbringing and how we can best support to bring back how it was once for them. So I take them back as far as I can, using the narrative.
So why did stories, you're talking about stories. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that, Regina, and the importance of stories?
Yeah, working in the community, work with DV, grief and loss, suicidal ideation, with children and mums and all that. So we use it in a way that's, especially with the DV stuff, or if a female is putting up with that, it's a learned sort of thing because she watched her mother go through it, so it's like a social normal. Mum went through it, so it must be the way. Well, no, it's not. We ask them what their beliefs are, their norms. It doesn't fit to the relationship they're already in, so it's like, okay, well, we need to raise that up about your own beliefs and values and your worth, your self-worth. If it doesn't fit the relationship, then it's not okay. So, yes, it's a bit tricky. But we just sort of, we go back as far as we can and unpeel all that for them.
Also, Regina, you've shared with us what some of the reasons why you were drawn to narrative therapy. From your point of view, now working with Aboriginal families over time, is there anything that worries you about narrative therapy and using it in those contexts?
I think thinking that following the narrative by step 1 to step 2 to step 3 just doesn't work. Yeah. I know that for a fact. I've been condemned by kids and it's not a good thing. When they, why are you talking to us like that? And it's like, maybe I shouldn't use a narrative so quickly. Yeah, and they're like, we're not going to talk to you, Auntie, you want to talk to us in that way? I was like, okay, it's fine. So I spent a whole lot of time changing the language of the narrative that fit the community. So that took me a long time to do, and I tried it once on someone who already had mental health issues, and she could have killed all of us in that room, and I was like, oh no. Then it was her damaging our name across the community, and we had elders ringing up, what are you doing? You got to come and speak to us and tell us what you're doing to this community. So from then on, we used to get permission from elders first to support it. So we were putting it out in an event for community that we're aware there is DV, we're aware that there is suicidal ideation, that there's young kids going unfed for however long, and there's trouble in the family. So we create this big event and we let everybody else go first, because if we show up first, they know what we're there for. It's like, oh no, here comes the intervention team. So we stayed back until that event was in process. Then they'd be like, oh, now we know why we're here. It's like, well, you know, it's safe ground, it's home and to everyone. So that's how we would do it. And we would listen to all their stories and get them to listen to their grandmothers and their, you know, grandfathers, and how they may have forgotten over time about their worth or value. And it does change. Some may not change all, but we still keep going.
So you've often talked to me about the importance of events and gatherings, Regina, and so can you give us a little bit more insight about, you know, coming from a narrative point of view, how that might look differently? So how do you enable people to start telling their stories and the safety of that? Because it seems to be quite significant, those gatherings.
It does. We'll hold an event where we've got stuff up around DV and around kids feeling unsafe or whatever it may be, and we've got the stalls there so that people know why they're here. They're told in advance while we're there. Then I'll sort of just walk around and, you know, stand there and talk to someone, and they'll say, you know, you've got like 5-10 minutes. We're like, yeah, absolutely. We sit down and we'll say to them, how are you coping with all this? Because it's basically there, all the signs are there, what we're here for today, and then they'll start talking about it, and then we arrange appointments. Well, we can come down and see you at home. You know, we'll come visit you, and we'll make it a regular thing until we work through it. So it's about just opening up the doorway. That whether they step through or not, that's up to them. But we can still keep trying.
So engagement through community.
And it's letting them know that we're all aware of what's going on, so then they're a little bit more reluctant to do something. Maybe on the smaller communities, they're a bit more reluctant to do DV down there because it's known. So yeah, it's just putting it out there that we are aware, and we have elders' permission, so we're not just going to rock up without council permission. It's already, you know, put out there.
Excellent. Thank you, Regina. So, Chris, Regina's spoken a little bit about some of the strengths and kind of the practice principles that she's used. I just wanted to also maybe turn to you and ask for your reflections. You know, working in different contexts, you've particularly worked, you know, with men, you know, one-on-one or in groups who have used violence. You know, if you reflect on narrative therapy, what are some of the key ideas that, you know, you kind of hang on to or think important or influential in your practice?
I think some of the practice principles that have been spoken about today that you've gone through, as well as that Kate ran through with that exercise, I think they're a great place to start in terms of thinking a bit about the principles that might shape this work for practitioners and services here that are interested in kind of taking them on. So rather than kind of replicating that, I thought I might just give a small account of some work that I did with a man, just to sort of try and bring those more to the fore a bit.
Excellent.
I'm sharing this story because, one, this fellow has given me permission to share this publicly. Should I move that aside, perhaps? It's always a bit of a dilemma sharing work in front of people, like exposing work to people that aren't familiar with how I work overall. But I hope it gives you a bit of an idea, and also perhaps might strike a chord, even though your context might be different, with perhaps strike a chord with you for your context a bit as well. Certainly at Uniting Communities, our family violence work is situated in a broader family relationships counselling team, where we meet with people around a whole range of different concerns. I hope I can still say we, even though I haven't worked there for 18 months. Is that all clear to say that? Thank you very much. And so, so we never quite know sort of what the concerns are that the person who we're about to meet with is kind of bringing into the room. And so this was certainly the case in meeting with James. Okay. Now, certainly one of the principles that Sarah and Kate have touched on today is around respectful collaboration. And I think it's interesting for us to think a bit about this and how we can even kind of create a context for collaboration with people before we even sort of meet with them. You know, how do we kind of describe our work and our roles in a way that kind of opens the door for collaborative work? You know, that the positions the person as being, you know, as far more than the problems that they're facing, that they're bringing into the room with. How can we describe our work in a way that really acknowledges, from a narrative perspective, I guess, you know, that lives are indeed multi-storied. And, you know, and so also I think as part of establishing collaboration with a man who's using violence, who's hurting people he cares about, is really, for me, for our team, has often been so much about really wanting to begin to understand something about his situation and what he's concerned about. And also maybe even what he might be hoping for by coming along. Sometimes those hopes are really hard for him to describe, or it might just be to get out the door as quickly as possible. That's quite a strong hope that some men have at times as well. But still, there's something in that we can be working with as well. So I'm just, given the focus of this research has been around engagement, I'm just going to go through some inquiries, some aspects of the conversation I had with him in our first conversation. Not to say that engagement is all done and dusted in the first session, of course, but just to give you a bit of a sense, I think, of some of these principles. So, you know, James is he's in his early 30s and lives with his female partner Melissa, and they have two preschool-aged children. They've been together for about 7 years. And so, you know, I just began by asking him what's important to be sort of letting me know about, given the time we've got today. And he said that he told me how he gets stressed out at times. He gets stressed out, and he gets angry when things get too much. And you know, so I asked him a few questions about this, and he said for over a year now he'd felt that things had gotten too much for him following the loss of a job and resulting financial pressure for his family, and he'd become quite ill with sleeplessness and ulcers that were affecting him as well. He said the financial pressures had eased just recently, but a few weeks ago, he said when he was feeling really crap, that's his words, he had an argument with Melissa, and then he took off in the car, okay? Had an argument and he took off in the car. And so, you know, I guess, you know, previously he'd kind of been bought into this idea that the stress was causing his anger, you know, and so therefore, now that the financial stress had dissipated a bit, he was now left a bit miffed, I guess, as to how come he would still be arguing and taking off in the car after an argument with Melissa. So I really just asked him if he could help me understand a bit more about his experiences of feeling crap, and he said that at times he would think about the financial hole that his family was in on account of his work situation, and this would make him very unhappy with the way life was going. And he says it's as though I pull back from people altogether, he said. So I'm beginning to understand something a bit about his situation and his concerns. I asked him what he means by pulling back. He said, well, things like, among other things, you know, being snappy with the kids, okay, and not talking to Melissa. So these are terms that we might sometimes hear that can sometimes be euphemisms for something else, can't they? Like being snappy. When he said about not talking for Melissa, I asked him a bit about the not talking, and he said, you know, for the not talking to come to an end, it has to blow up and become horrible, and then I take off in the car. So again, I'm hearing all of these very general descriptions, aren't I, of being snappy with the kids and blowing up and taking off. So, but I'm not, you know, I'm not wanting to impose any other kind of naming or tell him actually what's really going on here. I'm just staying with his naming of his experience at this stage. And, you know, because he's in front of me, I'm interested in how this is for him. How is it for you, James, to be pulling back with his family? What's that like for you to be doing that? He said, well, I hate it. I said, I hate not wanting to be with the kids. He said, you know, he went on to say they don't deserve it and Melissa doesn't deserve it either. And so, you know, this is one of the principles that highlighted as well, just beginning to understand the effects of what he's doing. So far, I've just addressed really the effects on him at this stage. I feel that's kind of fair, actually, just to ask him firstly about where all this leaves him. My intention is to ask him about where it leaves the kids and how it affects his partner as well. But, you know, I was interested in this, why he hates pulling back. This is kind of a bit interesting, isn't it? That if someone's pulling back and they're hating doing so, then this might get us onto some other conversations, other things about what's important to him. And so I asked him a bit about why does he hate this pulling back? What doesn't sit well with him about that? And he said, well, I want to be a good dad and husband, not a mongrel. He doesn't want to be a mongrel. He doesn't want to just shut them up all the time. Okay. So he's taking a position around what he's doing. He's declaring where he stands in relation to what he's doing. I'm not telling him he shouldn't be taking off or being snappy with the kids. He's actually taking a position around this. But he's told me he wants to be a good dad. So this is an opening into this thing, known as, in some circles, as kind of ethics or relationship ethics or ethical strivings or, in narrative practice, what's important to him in terms of what he gives value to in his life or what he hopes for his life. So I said, when you say you're a good dad, James, what do you mean? What sort of dad do you want to be? And so then we had a conversation a bit about the kind of father that he prefers to be, these ethics. What he gives value to as a father, his preferred way of being a father. And it wasn't about pulling back or shutting up the kids or being snappy or shutting up Melissa. It was about things like being involved with his family, doing things with them. With his kids, it was about not wanting to miss out on them being little. Okay? He wants to be there for them when they grow up, And so, some other questions that we can ask about this, taking a curious approach and sort of this idea of, storing people's experience. And I asked him, how does he want his children to remember him when they look back on this time of their life? And he says, well, he wants them to remember me being an involved dad, being involved in what they did in their life. I don't want them to remember being yelled at. So he's telling me more and more about what's going on, isn't he? As he's telling me about his preferences. I'm hearing two stories, really. What he prefers and what he's not so happy about with his life. But he's kind of declaring these. I'm not telling him. He said, I don't want them being scared of me. Okay? I don't want them being scared of me. So, these things don't just fall out the sky. We can be interested in the history of these things in men's life. And he said that, I asked him how long these things have been important to him. And he said, had they been important for a long time or were they something more recent for him? And he said he probably thought they actually went back to his own childhood. There was a lot of conflict at home, he said. It wasn't abusive, but I remember feeling scared of my own parents, all the arguing, and I didn't like that. Okay. I asked him if this somehow shaped what was important to him in his own family. And he said, yes, don't get me wrong, my parents weren't bad, but I want something better for my own children. And we talk more about that. Again, I asked him some more questions about the kind of family he's hoping to create with his partner, and he gave me some more descriptions of that, including these terms are pretty available to people often, I guess. Wanting to feel safe and happy and loved and secure. I checked in with him because I think this is a part of collaborative practice to, at times, just check in and ask how the conversation's going. And he said, it's going all right, it's going okay. I should have done something about this before now. And I asked him, so, what happened a few weeks ago when you took off in the car? Was that somehow linked to sort of making this appointment today? And he said, he confirmed that it was. And I just asked him, is it okay if I ask a bit more about that day? And he said it was okay, but he told me a bit more how a simple argument had turned into a full-on argument, which then had him yelling loudly. Okay, so he's beginning to tell me more and more increasing details of what he's done. And he said that I said some shocking things to Melissa, and that he smashed a light switch as well. Okay. So it's interesting to think a bit about what we talked about previously, even in this conversation, that made it just a fraction more possible for him to begin to name some of these things that he'd done that he was not so proud of. Okay, what had we talked about that provided a basis for him to actually be able to speak, to sort of look back on his life from a different perspective? And it wasn't just taking off in the car, it was burning off. He burnt off in the car, which I think sounds a quicker thing, I think. And that he stayed away for the rest of the day. Okay. Where had this left him, I asked. And he said, well, I was in a mess and I was upset. Okay, well, so I asked him, what was the upsetness in relation to? And he said, well, I feel like a total arsehole. Okay, so he's got these stories. He's not only a mongrel now, he's now an arsehole. Okay, So he's collecting these kind of identity conclusions, but I'm also hearing other things about what's important to him. He said, I hated myself for what I've done. I don't want to lose my family. And so I asked him, what particularly have you done that makes you feel like an arsehole? I'm not calling him an arsehole. These are his words, of course. He said, well, for saying those things to Melissa, it really upset her. He said, and the kids saw it, the kids heard it, and they saw it. Okay, so we're starting to get, because I've asked a bit about where this has left him, we're also getting to get on to a bit about where this has left his family as well, the effect of this on his family, which was my overarching intentions as well, of course. I think part of this accountable practice that's been talked about today already, among other things. I said, what do you think especially upset Melissa about this? And he said, just how mean I was, that I could even say the stuff I said. And again, it's so important that kids aren't invisible in this work, isn't it? So I asked him, how does he know the kids heard it? I'm not doubting him, but I'm wanting him to kind of step into his experience, but also step into their experience of that a bit. And he said, well, they're smart kids. And he said, the oldest one said to me, you made Mummy cry. Okay. So his daughter, who's only, in preschool, she was giving him some pretty important feedback, wasn't she? I sort of wonder what it might have even taken for her to say that. Probably shouldn't lose sight of that, actually, when we hear those kind of accounts from kids. What does it take for a child to say that to their father after seeing him be that way? Anyway, I said, how was it for you to hear her say that? And he said, well, it wasn't. He said other things, including it wasn't good, and he said it was an eye-opener. So the question, of course, is, what has his eyes been open to on account of his daughter saying this? He said, how it was for them, they'd been scared and upset, and that was also what prompted him to do something about it. Okay. He wants to do something about it. What is he hoping for by doing something about it? He's wanting to be able to, so he said things like he's wanting to be able to resolve arguments calmly, not hurt his family, not get out of control, and set a good example for my kids. Okay. So these all sound very reasonable things, don't they, for a fellow to be saying about what he's hoping for. But I was also wanting to ensure that, Melissa wasn't lost in all of this. And so, I said, what difference do you think it might make for Melissa for you to be doing something about it? And will she'd be pleased? Why would she be pleased about this? This was kind of, I'm not sure he thought so much about this. He said, well, she wouldn't be so scared in talking to me. Again, I didn't want to brush over her experience, so I asked him questions like, how does James know that Melissa was scared to talk with him? How did he know that? So again, inviting him to sort of reach into her experience or his knowledge of her experience. I mean, these are only guesses. I'm asking him to make guesses. He doesn't really know, but asking him to make guesses. And he said, well, she said it, and I've noticed it, not talking or backing off, just going quiet when we've got having an argument. He said, I asked him other questions like, has he always seen Melissa's backing off in this way? He said, sort of, I think this can be quite significant because sometimes men talk about, their partner kind of backs off and those kind of descriptions are decontextualised. It's all about her backing off rather than actually seeing the backing off as an effect of a long history perhaps of control or violence or abuse that has her making a very reasonable decision to back off for her own safety or her kids' safety. What was it like for him to see her, backing off and not talking? He said, well, it makes me think that, the yelling and saying those things is almost as bad as hitting. What are you kind of seeing that has you saying that? And he said, well, maybe just things how things are for her. Not to be able to talk about things with me, wondering about how I might react. And, this is not what I'm wanting. Because it's kind of at the intersection, I guess, of these conversations about a man's ethics and his use of violence. As he's realising the effects of that on his partner, it's kind of there where something happens where he feels like he's an arsehole or a mongrel, or I guess in middle class speak we might call that kind of shame, I guess. and so this is what gives him this shame, this mongrel conclusions reflects all sorts of, or beginning to reflect sorts of understandings and awareness about how what he's been doing has been affecting people close to him. This is a very rushed account of an hour-long conversation, and it's I've edited lots out, of course. But, you know, at the end of the conversation, I just checked in with him how the conversation's been, what's standing out, and he said, "Oh, it's been okay," and I was happy with that. You know, it's been okay. I was kind of pleased. At least it'd been okay. I've had other feedback, not quite as kind of encouraging as that. And he said, "Oh, so what's been okay?" And he said, "Oh, well, just thinking things through." Yeah. And I said, "Oh, you know, so fairly dogged, I guess." So you know, why has that been okay to just be thinking things through? He said, "Oh, maybe just a bit clearer about some things. You know, how what I've done. You know, what it's been like for Melissa." Yeah, sort of trailed off then the conversation, and so yeah, we didn't meet again. And there's lots more I could tell you about my work with James, but I hope that gives you a little bit of a sense of some of the principles that were sort of being talked about earlier and how they can be brought to life in our conversations with men. So,
thank you, Chris. I think, Regina, you've also shared with us already the way you've started to use narrative ideas, particularly with children. You use it with your community, in community events. And so I just would welcome your reflections, Regina, about if you would feel like you want to tell a story about your practice and what went particularly well, or what you learned along the way trying to use these ideas when working with families.
I guess to start off with, I'm a counsellor first before narrative therapist.
Yes.
I will use my narrative therapy when it's there after I've assessed the client, if they're able to handle that narrative, because you're actually going back to a very traumatic time for them where the trauma sits with them, and you've got to unpack it and find out what that means. Now, I had a client who was around 12. Mum insisted that she wasn't listening, that she was out of control. This was through CAMS at the time. So I went out to visit Mum, had a yarn with the daughter, and she's like, "Mum's, you know, very strict and she doesn't get me," and the mum was afraid that they weren't communicating very well, and she said, "I'm very anxious around my daughter." And I said, "Oh, okay." So I got the daughter hooked up into a after-hours group at the school because I wanted her to sort of be doing something while I was talking with Mum, because I felt Mum was the one that needed help. So I asked her, has she ever felt this anxiety before, and who was she with at the time? And she said, "Well, with my oldest daughter." And I said, "Oh, okay, so tell me about your oldest daughter." She said, "Well, we were the same. We weren't getting along. I was very strict with her and whatnot." And she said, "I came home one day and found her hanging in the room." So it was that anxiousness of losing her daughter now and letting her go out. And so it was recognising that her anxiousness was coming from a grief and loss that she had experienced prior. So then we got her connected with her sister. They hadn't spoken in years. That was very difficult because I was getting abuse on both sides. "How dare you come in here trying to get me to talk to her?" And I said, "Look, it's about supporting through this process." So finally got them talking. That was to help because she was becoming dependent on my presence. And then I said, "Now you're going to have to sit down and talk to your daughter around your grief and loss." Mm-hmm. That way it's sort of shared and you're able to recognise when you feel anxious again what that might be. Mm. But we needed to connect it with something that she's experienced in her past that maybe hasn't been dealt with. Yeah. Basically.
I think you've brought up a really important point, Regina, and you and I have had conversations about this. So in terms of, you know, using stories or understanding people's, you know, pasts or their histories can often be quite traumatic. And so how you sit alongside someone to be able to do that. Do you want to share what that's been like for you to sit alongside and enable, you know, that storytelling for the purpose of healing?
Yeah, most of them will. I mean, I've sat beside young kids, you know, when they're talking about the shameness they feel when they talk about how their parents fight. Mm-hmm. Then I've sat with mums who, you know, talk about, you know, "I don't want the community knowing that this is what happened." Well, I explained to her that's kind of too late because that's why we have this intervention program, and how I work with mum around where she's used her strengths before, how she's actually utilised that and gotten through that situation before. How did you walk through that before? Oh, this is what I've done. Or who was with you? Oh, I was with Nan. Well, where's Nan now? Oh, she's down at Rowcombe. Well, let's go visit her. So I'll identify her strengths about who she walked with in the past. So what she's dealing with today. As for the male, you know, it's about the kids. So we've got to talk about how the kids become the key to keeping them together. And it's like, yeah, you can't stay together and let the child be unstable and unsafe to go home. So it's about working with a child in the school, see what they're dealing with, and then taking it back and bringing the community in the know of what's happening and how we can work together. When you've got the whole community working together, everybody is stronger and they feel more safer talking about it. Yeah. So sitting alongside of them can be, for myself, it'll trigger something because they're my people. Yeah. Because their families, their mothers and grandmothers were high school kids with my mum. So that will trigger stuff for me, so I've got to learn how to hold myself back. Sometimes I'll have a cry with them and they'll be like, oh, you shouldn't be crying. But it's a way of coming in and looking not as a clinician, not as a therapist, as a person who's just there. Yeah. And then you've got to be very careful about attachment disorders, which we've gone through before. So it's about assessing how much they can handle of the narrative. So I don't often let them know I'm doing the narrative because they will disengage. Yeah.
Also, Regina, if that's okay, can I ask you about the concept of shame? And so we, in narrative therapy, that is a practice principle that's been named. But you and I have had a bit of a conversation about that and the use of the word shame in Aboriginal context. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, shame is already present in them. The minute we go down there and they know what we're there for, their heads are going to go straight down, so we know there's shame. We don't ever discuss it with them. We wait for them to bring it up. You know, shame when I saw you rock up. And it's like, yeah, I know, I saw the way you tilted your head there, and they'll laugh. So we'll turn a bit of a humour into it, and then we will talk about it. Only when they've opened the floor for it. If we do it for them, they're going to have they're going to come back at us and say, why are you sticking your nose in my business? So we are very careful. So I will stick with counselling first of what they're coming to me for at the time. Yeah. When they bring up something from the past, then I will start my narrative. Yeah.
I also just want to, before we finish up, just give Regina a chance. She's often talked to me about her work with children, and you've done Regina's talked to me about how she, as a narrative therapist, would reflect on her work with children and its applicability. And so you've done some creative stuff in that space, Regina. Do you want to tell us about it?
Yeah, I wrote a narrative journal, a book that I did through my diploma, and as I started writing, I only got about 20 pages, and I thought, this will be fine, this is just kids, they're all right. Took it in there, and they were all so critical, and I was like, I walked out of there feeling really bad. I went back to CAMS, and I'm like, I think I need counselling. So those kids were awful to me. I said, I'm not going back there again. But they said it with smiles on their faces. That sucks, Arnie. I was like, okay. So what is it? Well, we're not babies. Take that out of there. And I'm like, okay. So I went through the whole. So after working with the kids over a period of time and learning to become thick skinned around them, my journal ended up being 60 pages long. Yeah. So it started working. So I was then using my whole team. The team of three we had were using those books, the narrative books, to work with kids, because it opened up each page, and you had it would be a 1 page per session, and then we would work through it, and there would be drawings in between, and there would be highlights where they achieved, some sort of thing that they felt they lacked. It may be like they might have been ashamed not to go into the next classroom, or they might have been feeling anxious about something. So we work on each and every one of those emotions. I had got this little figure, and around it was little circles, so I'd ask, how was you feeling for the whole week? So they'd fill in the circles. I was sad, I was this. So I'd say, now roll it up into one ball and we'll give it one name. Every child used a swear word. They wanted to call this little thing, shit thing or stupid thing. And so I said, now we need to create what it looks like and what it's stopping you from doing. We're going to focus on that. So they would create a little model of some creature, and I'd say to them, leave it here with me and let me deal with that, what it's doing to you, and you go off to school and have a good week. And usually they would, because all their problems were left with me.
So again, I'm a little bit aware of time, but again, I just wanted to thank Regina for your insight. Again, listening to practice is one of the great ways I think that we can learn and to share, and for practitioners to share their stories about the challenges but the positives. You also open yourself up to be listened to. So can we just give both Chris and Regina a round of applause? We probably do have 5 minutes before what I want to do is wrap up today about some of the implications of the research, but also Kate wants to just feed back really briefly some of the thoughts that happened this morning around that case study. But before we do, so we just want to use the last 10 minutes to do that, but we might have a couple of minutes for questions. If anyone wants to ask Regina or Chris a particular question around their use of narrative and invitational ways of working. Anyone got any questions? Don't be shy, otherwise we'll move on. Excellent, thank you, Rachel.
This could be for both of you, I suppose. What have you found in your practice that would be the biggest or common blocker to moving forward?
Good question. The
Like
biggest
from
or
blocking
the
the narrative, or blocking, sorry, that's me going into my blocking out what? The narrative?
Moving forward.
Oh, and moving forward?
In the process.
Oh, geez. Could be a lot of things. It could be you've wrecked yourself with community. You might have said something and you've been told to leave. They're disengaging. Or simply that it's conflict of interest because it's too close to home. With myself, I've actually had to let clients go because I already know that, because they lived down the road from me and I've been watching all the DV stuff, so it's how could I sit there and do counselling with it? It's like, don't lie to me, I was watching you the other night. So it's like I can't get involved. So anything around that, it's conflict of interest.
yeah.
I won't get involved. So other than that, if it feels it's not working, then I will keep going until we're actually stopped by the people themselves and saying we don't want to see anymore. It's like, okay then.
I think, I was sort of taking up your question in terms of what might block men from moving forward, say, in my work with them. So I appreciated Regina's reflections from her angle. I think that there's so many things, I guess, that can get in the way. I guess in some of the, I think one thing that I find particularly challenging in my practice in working with men is, because of our interest in the man's ethics or what's important to them in their relationships, sometimes these are pretty hard to get onto in conversations, I think I find it most difficult when the man is using violence towards his family in a context of other interpersonal violence in his life, where he's kind of, swimming in a lake of violence, I guess, in his life. And getting onto those, I guess for me it's about holding the position that a man does hold these values and ethics, actually. I start to be convinced that he doesn't. I start to be persuaded that perhaps they're not there in a way. And so how do we respond to this kind of dilemma, I guess? That's the next question. I think it might depend a bit on how we think a bit about these things that are important to men, these values or ethics. I guess if we think of them as somehow being internal to a man, sitting inside somewhere, then I think it's more easy to be convinced that they don't exist. Okay, but I think if we think of these values that are important to men, in terms of how they are as a father or partner, not existing inside them, but kind of, circulating in the air we breathe, that people can kind of draw on at different times in their life to shape their life. So, these ideas of, cultural stories or discourses that circulate that are about, relationships of mutuality and respect and care. They're out there. They're just harder for some men to grab hold of than others. And I think, Rachel Hare-Muston, a feminist family therapist from a long time ago, said that the practitioner's room is a mirrored room. It only kind of reflects the discourses or ideas that the practitioner and the person bring into the room. And so I think as practitioners we can have a responsibility to bring different sort of understandings about masculinity or fathering or whatever into the room. And one way we've done that at Uniting Communities is we've had conversations in groups about what men give value to as a partner and a father. We document these, and we've made posters out of these kind of descriptions. And at different times, we've had these posters in the waiting room. Okay, and a lot of times, men would comment on these posters, where they read descriptions of other ways of being a father that kind of strike a chord with them. About being there for their kids or not wanting partners to be scared of them. And so we can use other men's words to kind of bring these ideas into the room, men that have faced similar circumstances. So I think, that's certainly a blocker, but I think there are also, there are ways forward for us, in relation to that as well. So thanks, Rachel.
That's a great question, Rachel. One more question, was there?
Yeah. I'm wondering what the role of recognising broader patriarchy and the trauma that imposes on men throughout their life is in this process. I'm wondering how you strike a balance between recognising that patriarchy is really damaging to women, but it's also really damaging to men in that there's certain feelings they're not allowed to feel, certain things they're not allowed to do. How do you balance recognising these broader systemic forces that have played a role in enabling these men to use violence, but not taking away the accountability of their actions? How do you strike that balance?
Yeah, sure.
You could also ask similarly, what has colonisation done to our Indigenous communities?
Shall I begin, and then would you want to begin?
Do you work with the men? I don't.
Okay, sure. So, really important question. I guess there's perhaps a couple of ways that kind of are possible in relation to that. As I mentioned earlier, that for some men they do have they have been living, or they do. We all live, I guess, with the effects of patriarchy in our life, and for some men this is experienced in terms of abuses or injustices that they've been subjected to as young people or as children. And so, how do we kind of pay attention to those whilst not diminishing the responsibility for what they are doing? And I think this is really a really interesting area of work, because it's important not to, because often men might use those stories from their life as being kind of justifications for their use of violence, or explanations for them, which are kind of end up being dead ends because they diminish responsibility. And so one way I think is actually to not be ignoring those, but actually be inviting men to be describing some of those experiences, but to be storing not just what was done to them, perhaps as a child or young person that was outrageous or unfair, not just hear about the abuse they were subjected to, but also about the kind of how they responded to that abuse as a child or young person as well, because it's in that response that actually speaks to other things about the man that's important to him. So I've had many conversations with men who have been subjected to abuse or other injustices as a child, and to hear stories of how they responded, actually, I can ask them questions a bit about not only what that took to do that, but what these responses reflect about what's important to them. And that perhaps, even as a kid, when they distracted their father from hurting their mother, they were actually, even then as a kid, taking a stand against violence, weren't they? I mean, this is what I'm thinking. I want to invite them into making, those kind of meanings, because if they're taking, so this history of taking a stand against violence might have been present as a child, but it's also present in the therapy room when they're rocking up for a conversation as well, or in the group program. And so actually taking a stand against violence, there's a history there. Not only is there a history of their use of violence, but a history of taking a stand against violence. And so we can be interested in both of those things. It's not to diminish the current use of violence. It's not to say that what they are subjected to is the same as what their partners experience. We can have those conversations without getting caught in that. But that's just one way that provides some options for us. But there are others as well.
No, I don't really work with men, but I have spoken to a couple of men around their DV because I knew them growing up, and I've learned. Well, they've agreed that they would rather be called participants in DV, which I changed the language for them they were more comfortable to talk with me if I called them participants. And because I didn't like the word either, perpetrator. So yeah, and I've got a few stories from them. I'm actually working on a current DV cycle, cultural DV cycle, according to the men's responses to their violence towards women. So that's still working on that.
Really good questions. I'm just a little bit aware of time, so can we just give another round of applause for wonderful Regina and Chris, please?